Before I start, hands up here, who's a flexitarian? A reducitarian? A vegetarian? Or a vegan? Hands up, I'm one. Keep your hands up, and I'd say this is probably not as representative as the general population, but keep your hands up if this is a change from 5 years ago. Yeah. You're not alone. Vegetarianism is on the rise in Australia. According to Roy Morgan research in 2019, nearly 2.5 million Australians, that's 12.1% of the population, have diets of which the food is all or almost all vegetarian, up from under 2.2 million 4 years ago in 2014. And today I'm going to talk a little bit more about this trend, the markets that it opens up, and the opportunities to take advantage of this trend. But firstly, an apology. You're meant to get Dan Terrell, the author of the report that is referenced throughout this presentation, and unfortunately due to a personal family illness, he's unable to travel, and so you've got me. G'day, my name's Jericho, I'm a Senior Manager at Monitor Deloitte, and I'm the Lead Director for our agribusiness sector, and I'm super passionate about sustainable food systems. So I've talked a little bit just in my intro about dietary changes, and today I'm going to talk specifically about the plant-based meat sector. And what do we mean by that? Well, the plant-based products are designed to replicate the sensory eating experiences of conventional meat. And if you sat in that session just before lunch, when Hugh gave us the most evocative description of cooking and eating a ribeye and didn't want to go out for a ribeye at lunchtime, that is exactly the sensory experience and the emotive experience I'm talking about of eating meat. And that plant-based meats in particular are looking to be an alternative too. Now, there are other alternatives to meats, such as microalgae or lab-grown cell-based meat, but today I'm just going to focus on the plant-based meats, those that are grown from pulses, nuts and seeds. And you tend to see plant-based meats as burgers, sausages or mince, not replacing lean cuts of meat. And that's primarily due to that muscle structure of meat itself. Now, before we go too much into this disruption, let's just say disruption itself is not new. We've seen significant changes before that has impacted our reliance on animals. For example, the animals used to be a great source of fats, such as whales or for butter, and that's certainly changed now to a move towards more plant-based oils, such as canola. And we're used to rely on animal fibres, animal coats, pelts, fur, and then into growing cotton and now synthetics. And dairy was all milk. And now, of course, we've got the rise in plant-based milk alternatives. So these sorts of mega trends have happened before, but let's look a little bit more deeply at what's driving this. So throughout today, I'm going to go a bit broad in terms of looking at a global demand and what's driving that. And I'm going to look at the global demands for protein and plant-based alternatives. And I'll look at who might win and lose in future scenarios. And if you recall, Steve right at the front talked about, as an industry, we need to look at future scenarios and consider how the world might play out. Well, I've actually got 4 that I'm going to take you through now as well. And then I'm going to look specifically at what is happening within Australia. So first, from a global point of view, we've seen a rise in the demand for protein, but what's driving that? Well, protein is an essential part of our diets, and demand for protein will only keep growing. It's expected to rise anywhere between 32 and 78% by 2050, driven by a growing world population. We'll simply have more mouths to feed, rising affluence, particularly of that middle class. And if you think about, Maggie Jo spoke about specifically the rise in the Chinese middle class, urbanisation and changing eating habits. We're seeing the Western diet influence more and more across the globe. However, on the other side, we're seeing concerns around sustainability, animal welfare and health are driving consumers' concern for alternative, or driving consumers' demand for alternative protein sources to conventional meat. Just dwelling on those, what's driving the sources to alternative proteins, well, firstly, sustainability. And raising livestock for food is not as efficient as eating plants. Yes, cropping is generally the best land use. There will be some occasions, particularly in Australia, where you simply cannot crop land that's used for livestock. But in general, globally, animal agriculture is a leading cause of deforestation, land degradation, biodiversity loss and habitat clearing worldwide. So it's a huge driver for reduction in meat consumption. And while animal welfare is probably less of an issue here in Australia, there's still some ethical considerations that are driving consumer demand. And finally, from a health point of view, while meat is a great source of nutrients such as protein, iron and zinc, consuming high levels of conventional meat has also been linked to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes and some cancers, which are the leading causes of death in Australia. And then, of course, the protein industry impacts 8 of the 17 United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, which means we need to look at finding proteins other than animals. And this is causing consumers to question whether eating meat is the right thing. So let's step into these 4 scenarios. What might future demand for protein look like? Who will win and who might lose? Now, this is a big think piece, right? So to answer this question, I need you guys to think and go on a bit of a thought experiment with me across 4 futures based on 2 critical uncertainties. And the 2 critical uncertainties I want you to think about are our global market connectivity, whether we're really highly connected or a low level of connectivity, which cannot be any more relevant at the moment given the conversation around coronavirus and the impact it's having, as well as trade barriers or tariffs, and then also in terms of resource-intensive agriculture and resource-efficient agriculture. Now, to do this thought piece, you could pick other uncertainties. And in fact, what I'd recommend in any kind of scenario planning is that you map out what are the most important, impactful and uncertain future scenarios, and then you map them against that to create 4 worlds. So as I'm talking through these 4 scenarios, I want you to think to yourself, who would win in this situation? Who would lose? And what might be the opportunities for alternative proteins? So in the top left-hand corner is unchecked consumptions, which is a world of high connectivity and a resource-intensive world. It's today's world accelerated into 2030. High growth, but with consequences. Consumers are king, trade accelerates and protein demand surges. Technology spurs efficiencies in production and distribution, but yield is priority number 1. It's mainly animal-based protein. Demand sources are driven by the preference for Western diets, and the footprint expands. The impact on production on the earth becomes irreversible. In the bottom left-hand corner, we've got a low connectivity and we've got resource intensive. This becomes what we've called survival of the richest. There's a broad distrust in globalisation, resulting in slow economic growth and volatile markets. Access to food in the least developed countries is challenging, resulting in accelerating poverty and hunger, conflict and migration. Greater volumes of less nutritious proteins are eaten. Production is not sustainable. Income gaps widen. Countries race to secure arable land, and climate change continues unabated. Technology access and adoption is fragmented, caused by a crisis mindset, and only a few benefit. Then if I move to the other side, which is highlight some of the resource efficiencies, the top right one is around open source sustainability, and this is the rise of mutual benefit. And it's a move towards other more sustainable sources of protein. Consumers know the real cost of food, markets and policies, and they enable sustainable choices. A proliferation of protein sources reduces over-reliance and preference for animal-based proteins. Open platforms improve technology accessibility, but there's no incentive for long-term R&D. And finally, in the 4th corner, local is the new global. In a disconnected global market, nations turn inward and comparative advantages are lost. Focuses on traditional diets and local production. Progressive policies reduce the price point for healthier diets and more diverse protein sources. Shorter supply chains and increased plant-based diets reduce environmental strain. Import-dependent nations suffer, hunger hotspots proliferate, country-specific innovation flourishes, but diverse standards hamper scale. Now, this is a fun thought experiment, right? And you can see aspects of each of those potentially playing out. And it also brings to life some parts you might like to see happen and some that you might not like to see happen. And it also calls into how we might use alternatives such as insects or cell-based meats and even less food waste to deal with some of these issues. But all of those are actually long-term burns. Because there's something happening right here in Australia right now, and that's plant-based meats. So if I can park global for a moment and step into what's happening here in Australia with the Australian plant-based meat sector, this is one alternative where a commercial market already exists in Australia. And as I said before, this product aims to replicate the sensory experience of cooking and eating meat. Plant-based meat is targeted towards flexitarians as opposed to vegans or vegetarians, and reducitarians. So reducitarians are just trying in general to reduce the amount of meat they eat, and flexitarians are predominantly taking a plant-based diet with the occasional bit of meat. In 2018 to 19, Australian consumers spent an estimated $150 million on plant-based meat products. $115 million of that was in grocery channels like your Coles and Woolworths, and $35 million of that was in food service like Grilled, Lord of the Fries, or my local burger joint in Northcote, 300 grams. Domestic manufacturing of plant-based meat generated almost $30 million in value add, representing its contribution to GDP, and the sector employed 265 full-time employees in 2018-19. The total indirect economic contribution of the plant-based meat sector to the Australian economy is estimated to be $24.9 million in value add, in value-added terms such as food processing, professional, scientific, technical and other services, utilities, transports, and employed 161 FTEs. And it's basically come from nothing. So I can't give you a growth statistic here because it's not been measured before, and it'd be a meaningless statistic. But we're looking to update this again in this 2019-2020 and get a view of that growth rate. So if this is what it looks now, the question becomes, how big will it get? And that's a question that Deloitte Access Economics set out to answer with Food Frontier to quantify for the first time in Australia the size of the sector and its future growth potential. And that was a question that was asked earlier, how big could this actually be? And this work involved information gathered through industry consultation with supermarkets, distributors and food service businesses, combined with observations from international markets and economic modelling. The full report is available from the Food Frontier website, and I've referenced it extensively throughout, and I suggest you download it. It's an excellent read. And Deloitte Access Economics modelled 3 future scenarios for the plant-based meat manufacturing sector in Australia. Each scenario considered the domestic and international trends and consumption patterns that are likely to impact its future growth. And for scenario 2 is basically the status quo, which is if the current moderate growth trajectory continues, plant-based meats become a popular and accessible alternative. The Australian plant-based meat manufacturing sector would generate over $1 billion in value add, incorporating both the direct and indirect economic contribution of the sector. It would employ over 6,000 Australians, including direct employment in the sector itself and the resulting employment in upstream sectors. And it's equivalent to a CAGR of 43% growth, which scares me, but at the same time, when you consider that we're the growth rate that we're essentially looking at now, that's actually quite conservative. The first scenario, which we termed the conscious consumer's choice, represents a more conservative growth trajectory to 2013. It's still a 30% CAGR, which is a strong acceleration we're seeing now, but then it very quickly plateaus. Even in this more conservative scenario, it still generates $398 million in value add to the economy and employs 2,100 FTEs, either directly or indirectly. And finally, in the third scenario, we call this the high growth scenario, the mass market commodity. Here we see plant-based meats emerge as a dietary staple driven by an accelerated move away from conventional meat. We modelled this with plant-based meats providing a source of protein for between 4 to 6 meals per week for at least 50% of the population, with Australians consuming an average of 15.5 kilograms of plant-based meat each year. It results in a total of $2.9 billion in direct and indirect value add, with a total of 15,356 Australians directly or indirectly employed. And this scenario is equivalent to a CAGR of 58% growth in value from 2030, from its 2018-19 baseline. And it relies on a high degree of innovation as well. Now, I'm not for a moment going to stand here and suggest that the livestock sector is the flip side of this and that it is going to be declining. it's not going to be declining anytime soon. And in fact, the short-term prospects are very good. I'm sure Dave will talk further about that. But I think the opportunities for plant-based meats is to capture that excess demand, particularly global demand for proteins from a global rising population and the factors I mentioned before. And I think the study highlights the potential for this sector to drive the growth in the Australian economy as consumer preferences, diets continue to evolve. It highlights the importance of continued investment attraction and R&D in the sector, as Australian businesses will face significant competition from developed markets. And it highlights the opportunities which are emerging now in the industry if Australia can leverage its reputation for high-quality food products. And we talked about that in the sessions before the break, of going how well known Australia is for that clean and green and how strong its brand reputation is. And if we can capture that growing global demand for alternative proteins. Thank you, I might skip the bit. Thank you.